Hi, I'm Brendan Hesse, and this is The Crawl, a series about game design and development. As many of you know, my next game is a first-person, exploration-based game heavily inspired by classic dungeon crawler RPGs. In the last episode of The Crawl, I said I was going to talk about why I decided to make a dungeon crawler, but first I think it's worth defining exactly what I mean when I say dungeon crawler. Specifically, I'm referring to a niche subgenre of role-playing games known as DRPGs. That's short for Dungeon RPGs. I don't necessarily mean action RPGs like Diablo or Path of Exile. While Diablo and Path of Exile are arguably more synonymous with the phrase dungeon crawler these days, and they share the same DNA as DRPGs, they're not quite what I'm going for. Now, I don't blame you if you haven't heard the DRPG acronym before. It's pretty much only used by fans of this obscure and highly specific style of RPG, but they're easily identifiable once you know what they are. The earliest RPGs were directly inspired by D&D and other tabletop role-playing games. These games were being made as far back as the late 70s, hot on the heels of the D&D craze, but it wasn't until the 80s that the genre hit its stride thanks to games like Ultima and Wizardry. These games had a massive impact on the entire gaming industry, influencing not just JRPGs, but action-adventure games like Zelda, first-person shooters, and a lot more. I won't go into the full historical significance of these games. For that, I would recommend the video How RPGs Invaded Japan by Mark Brown of Game Maker's Toolkit. But suffice it to say that at some point, these early RPGs started evolving beyond their early forms. They made the jump to home consoles with the original Dragon Quest, Phantasy Star, and Final Fantasy, introducing a much more accessible form of role-playing games to a broader and generally younger audience. These JRPGs, or Japanese RPGs, became increasingly focused on story and characters, taking place in bigger and more varied settings. Computer RPGs, or CRPGs, and Western RPGs, as they're now known, doubled down on their complexity with bigger worlds, more systems, and more to do than just putz around caves and dungeons. However, there is a small but hardy crop of RPGs that have stayed true to the simple, dungeon-crawling roots of those early RPGs. Those are the DRPGs. Now, why would I want to make a DRPG? Well, it mostly comes down to what I want to accomplish with my game. I prefer games that emphasize mechanics over story, where players are encouraged to explore both the game's systems and its levels on their own. Those qualities aren't exclusive to dungeon crawlers by any means, but it's almost always the experience these games offer. So obviously it would make sense that if that's what I want to play, that's what I want to make. DRPGs are role-playing games at their most focused and, often, most difficult. They strip out vast overworlds and sprawling narratives, and usually take place in a single town where you shop, recruit, heal party members, take on quests, and actually that's about it. The rest of the time, you're in the dungeon, whether that's one dungeon or many dungeons. The point is, 99% of these games task you with exploring challenging labyrinths filled with monsters, traps, secrets, and tons of loot. As someone who usually enjoys exploration and gameplay over story and dialogue, I appreciate how games like, say, Etrian Odyssey deliver a system-driven experience without long cutscenes or exposition dumps. It's not saying that I don't love me a good RPG storyline, mind you. It's just, sometimes I want to grind through enemies, not dialogue boxes. In that regard, DRPGs are kind of like roguelikes, but often with less randomization and usually no permadeath, so playthroughs feel more consistent. The original Rogue was definitely a dungeon crawler, and in fact most modern-day roguelikes still are, so there's plenty of cross-pollination between these two genres. In fact, due to the popularity of both the original Rogue and Wizardry in Japan, the DRPG and roguelike genres were much more popular there than in the West. At least until indie devs and Kickstarter brought about a renaissance for both styles of game over the last decade or so. Still, it's uncommon to see many games coming from Western developers that stick to the classic formula. More often, you'll see games going for a Souls-like or rogue-light style if they're trying to be a hardcore RPG, rather than trying to be Etrian Odyssey, The Darkspire, etc. There are plenty of exceptions, however, such as Grimrock, Starcrawlers, or even Darkest Dungeon. Something I like about all of these games is their use of narration rather than cutscenes to explain what happens when you run into, say, a trap or a mysterious object while exploring. they play more like a tabletop session in that regard. It's an opportunity to let the player use their imagination, adding an extra layer of immersion to the experience, at least I feel. It also gives developers a chance to present complex events or puzzles to the player, even if they don't have the budget or scope to render everything in-game. As someone who's making a DRPG myself, I find that encouraging and, honestly, kind of a relief. That's not to say these games look bad. Many have incredible art and great level design, but most use tile-based graphics for the dungeons, with hand-drawn or pixel enemies, backgrounds, and character art. While that may look simpler than the massive AAA open-world RPGs like The Witcher 3, I'm actually really into it. Personally, I'm more confident as an artist and gameplay designer than I am as a programmer or 3D modeler anyway. So, using static character art and building corridor-based levels out of a handful of tiles is much easier than creating large realistic environments or animating tons and tons of characters. Basically, what I'm saying is, DRPGs are expected to have a limited presentation, story, and mechanical complexity, and instead focus on art, level design, gameplay, and immersion, which are things I'm much more comfortable with anyway. That said, I don't want to sell DRPGs short. They're still difficult to make, and the best push the boundaries of the genre and introduce new, novel gameplay ideas. But my game won't be doing that. I'm keeping it tightly focused and drawing from tried and true systems as much as possible. I may experiment with ideas when they make sense, but I'm trying to stay focused and honest with myself here. Ultimately, I'm more interested in creating a specific vibe for the player through art and interesting level design than I am in creating the next great battle system or innovating on RPG skill trees or something like that. And actually, in that regard, I think my skills and background can introduce some novelty to the dungeon crawler genre. As much as I love playing DRPGs, the truth is very few of them appeal to me aesthetically. I'm a big fan of Dark Souls, The Elder Scrolls, and even Lord of the Rings, but in general, I don't really like Western medieval fantasy, and that's what 99% of DRPGs are. And I get it, that's what the old school games did, but I'm more of a sci-fi dude. I like Halo, Mass Effect, Alien, No Man's Sky, and most importantly to me, Metroid. Hell, even science fantasy like Star Wars, Xenoblade Chronicles, and Phantasy Star. That all appeals to me visually much more than, say, The Witcher. In fact, I don't even like The Witcher 3 simply because I just couldn't get into the world. It's a good game, it's just not my thing. If there's fantasy that I do like, I find I'm more inclined towards Japanese takes on fantasy. Stuff like Zelda, Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest. Maybe it's because I grew up with Nintendo and anime, but I've always found Japanese fantasy to be more palatable than Western fantasy. Who knows why? I guess I just like alien planets and starships more than castles and dwarven mines for whatever reason. Point is, I'm not much of a fantasy guy, which makes it hard to really vibe with most DRPGs. Sure, there's stuff like Star Crawlers, which is excellent by the way, and a bunch of great Shin Megami Tensei dungeon crawlers that take place in full-on sci-fi settings, but that's kinda it, at least when it comes to sci-fi DRPGs specifically. So I guess the other reason I decided to make a DRPG is because I want to make a game that I wish already existed. I can't be the only one who wishes there were more DRPGs that feature a sci-fi setting, so I'm gonna make one, even if it's bad. Truthfully, what I really want to make is a game that plays more like Metroid Prime, Mega Man Legends, or Dark Souls. Those are all far more complicated games with action-based combat that would require much more work to create. However, that Metroidvania level design isn't far off from what many dungeon crawlers offer, at some level anyway. So instead of trying to make my own take on Metroid Prime, I'm instead going to attempt to make a DRPG with Metroid-inspired level design. Will I pull it off? Who knows, but that's the goal. So yeah, that's why I've decided to make a dungeon crawler RPG. But because I'm going for that Metroidvania level design, that's where my early development work has been focused on almost entirely. So in the next episode, we'll talk more about this Metroidvania level design philosophy and my own process for how I've been planning out the early version of my game's environments.